Hey all, welcome to my lesson for Opus 60 number 1 by Fernando Sor. This version of the piece comes from Guitar Curriculum, and this is one of the first solos, if not the very first solo that I give to all of my students as they get to that phase of their playing. Now, as you're learning this song, you're really going to want to make sure that you learn line by line, so 4 measures at a time. The piece is nicely sectioned into 4 measures, and there's no point in moving on to, the second 4 measures or the third or the fourth until you've really mastered the beginning. And as you're doing that, you may even find that certain measures take more practice than others. So let's take those first 2 measures where you just have 3 notes. You may be able to get that very quickly, but once you get to the 3rd and 4th measures, there's a lot more detail, more notes, and it's probably going to take you more time. And in some of the really tough measures, perhaps measure 7 and measure 14 especially, those 2 measures always stand out to me as ones where you might want to go note by note. And what you'll find is that even if the full measure feels difficult, adding 1 note at a time usually isn't too difficult. And that's how we want it to feel eventually. So let's take measure 7, for instance. We have 4 notes, A, C, D, and F sharp. And so the first time you might just want to go A, C, not so hard, right? Just do that until it feels automatic, and then add 1 more note. A, C, D. Do it as many times as you have to until you are automatic with it. And then add F sharp. One trick to that is you want to make sure that that middle finger wasn't staying down on A, or else it's going to have to really move very fast, and you may make a sound like that as you do that. So lift that A as soon as you play C, and then that finger is free to get F sharp, and then make sure that the pinky lifts as soon as you play F sharp, because you're going to need that for G. And once you feel good about those 4 notes, it's good to add the next one as well, G. Really be prepared to practice that quite a bit. Same thing with measure 14. Start with F, A, F, A, D, F, A, D, F, okay? As many repetitions as it takes. Now, this brings me to another point, which is that for certain parts of this, really, there's no bad part to do this with. You're going to want to do what I like to call my students, or what I like to tell my students is called stop motion practice. And when I say stop motion practice, what I'm referring to is playing 1 measure plus the first note of the next measure. And you can do it, there's many different ways that you can do this, but this is the most basic form of it. So from the beginning, that would mean going C, B, G, C. And then you can do the same thing. Let's move to the 3rd line though, measure 9. This is the line where I think you'll benefit the most from this practice. So that would mean going G, G, E, G, F, F, G, D, F, E, E, G, C, E, D, and then D, B, G, F, E, going to the first note of the next line. So you can do that for every measure. If it's really feeling good and you're consistent at that, then you can do 2 measures at a time. G, G, E, G, F, G, D, F, pause right there, and then do the same thing for 2 more measures. And slowly you'll work your way to doing the entire piece that way. So as you're improving, as you're learning tougher music, it's really critical that you develop these practice habits. It's not so much about just having the most talent to instantly be able to learn all of these, but it's being able to break it down in your practice and make a large piece of music with lots of notes really manageable. So that's how I'm going to suggest that you learn this. You really just have to practice all these parts in all these different ways, and just remember in your practice to be results oriented. And by that I mean you practice it until you get the results that you want. Just because you practice one measure 5 times like you practice the other measures doesn't mean that that measure is going to automatically sound good. You have to listen for that, and you have to feel when it sounds good. And when you think that you can consistently hit it pretty much every time, that's the result you want, and that's what we're going for. All right, let's talk about the musicality of this piece. And the dynamics that are written in, I find to be really good. Look at measure 3 and 4. You have a crescendo in measure 3, followed by a decrescendo in measure 4. To me, that means that the loudest note will be the first note of measure 4, F. So when you play that, start soft, and give yourself room to grow, and then really make sure that we can hear both the crescendo and the decrescendo. Just because you think you're doing it doesn't mean we hear it, so be really obvious, start really soft. And end really soft. And yeah, just really exaggerate those sorts of things, because if you don't exaggerate it, chances are it's not really coming across to the audience. You have to be very obvious about it. So pay attention for those dynamics everywhere in this. We have at the end of the second line, measures 7 and 8, we have the same thing. Play it the exact same way. Crescendo, decrescendo, and the first note of measure 8 is the loudest. All right, one other musical phenomenon that I want to talk about is what's happening on the third line. And the third line just looks weird because we have these notes just bouncing around. G, G, E, G, F, G. We keep going down to this low G. And the reason is that in this line there's really 2 things going on. We have a melody, which does not include those low Gs. So it's really just this. Those notes. So take out the low Gs until you get to the last measure of the line. And then the Gs are something else entirely. It's just this bass note. Okay? So together it should sound a little bit more independent. And the way to achieve that is to play it separately. Play just the melody. And then add the Gs, and as you add the Gs, still try to hear the melody that you created on its own. And then that last note, F, is almost really has more to do with the next line. All right, this has been my lesson over Opus 60 number 1. Just remember all those dynamics and all those practice strategies. This piece is all about the strategies that you use when you're trying to learn it, and it will cut down the amount of time that it takes drastically. Don't just play through the whole thing on repeat, really break it down. All right, thanks for watching.